All right, hello YouTube. After a brief delay figuring out some technical issues, we are here live with a classical theist who is going to help us all understand modernism and the encyclical Pascendi and really how it applies to our lives as Catholics, because that document does go into some heavy theology and heavy philosophy, but really there are some core meaty ideas that we really need to understand. So why don't you introduce yourself and let people know where they can find you, the places you want them to find you.
Yeah, well, I am go by the name Classical Theist. I use the term. It's a term from natural theology, from apologetics. So that's pretty much my primary domain. I make videos, although I've been a bit inactive lately, trying to popularize, I guess, for lack of a better term, Thomistic philosophy, Thomistic natural theology, understanding God through reason, and trying to justify the truth of the Catholic faith from rational principles. And so that's what I do on YouTube, and I try also to do it on Twitter. I've been busy kind of lately, so I haven't been able to put out much content, but that'll probably change over the spring and the summer. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Okay. I did post a video to for people to check out of yours on the both in the Facebook group that I run as well as on the community page, so that people can check it out if they are so inclined. I want to just make sure that we actually are live here, because I notice I'm not getting it.
I see the indicator.
Yes, but I'm not getting a notification in my own private account saying that we're live. So now I'm going to go take a look, because I just want to make sure, because anything that can go wrong will go wrong, you know what they say. No, it says there's one for 8:09. That's 5 minutes ago. Okay, hold on. Let's see, where's the settings for this? So I want to make sure, because it says we're live, but it doesn't mean we're public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't see the broadcast live on your channel.
All right, let's see. Broadcast alert none. It's streaming. It's just not showing as anything right now. Total view time, peak currents. Oh, come on.
Yeah, I don't see a public broadcast.
There's a way to change that, though. Info and settings. Let's go into info and settings for the stream. Unlisted. There it is. Let's try this again. Okay, we're going live right now.
Okay, there it is.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to try this again. Welcome to the Tradcast #1 with Classical Theist. We're going to be talking about Pascendi and Modernism. It's a pretty meaty encyclical, but there's a lot of good things for us to learn as everyday Catholics regarding this encyclical. So sorry to have you do this again, but I'd go ahead and give a quick introduction of yourself for people to, get to know what you do, basically.
Yeah, sure. I go by the name Classical Theist. I basically just post videos and run a Twitter account trying to popularize Thomistic philosophy, Thomistic theology, and it's basically apologetics driven, and in an attempt to defend the Catholic faith from rational principles. Haven't been able to put out much content on YouTube as of late, given a busy schedule, but I plan to change that in the spring and the summer when I got a lot more free time. So that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, and for anybody who's interested, I did put a video of his your defense of Christianity. I put that on the community page, and I believe on our Facebook page as well. So people should go have a look at that later. So why don't we dive into Pascendi, because it's a pretty, like I said, it's a pretty meaty document.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, go ahead.
So Pius X sort of outlined the doctrine of the modernists by sort of boiling it down, if you want to call it that, and that as gigantic of an encyclical as that was, into three kind of core points. His first point was sort of this philosophical agnosticism, which he linked to Kantian philosophy, which leads to vital imminence or immanentism, which again he says comes from Kant and Schleiermacher. I studied some philosophy in grad school, and I never actually read Schleiermacher. I'm assuming you did. That you've read
I
Schleiermacher.
haven't really read him, but
okay, no, that's fine. But yeah, I know you've read Kant because I've seen you speak about Kant before. And then radical evolution, or the concept of faith being subject to science. So why don't we start with what is philosophical agnosticism in terms of modernism, and what the Pope meant by that?
this I think he talks about in, let's see, in paragraph 6. And what he basically does is he starts out discussing the Kantian wedge, between the phenomena and the noumena. So the appearance of things and the things as they are in themselves. And what he basically says is that what the modernists do is they adopt that principle that our capacity for knowledge is unable to pierce really into the nature of things as they really are extramentally outside of the mind. And because of that, any kind of knowledge of God, any kind of piercing into nature's principles to understand its transcendent source, it's to get at the source of nature. You cannot get that from what we experience extramentally from the senses. And so essentially it's a rejection of what Vatican I dogmatizes, right? Which is that the existence of God and his attributes and nature can be known from the visible things that are made in the world. This is basically refined to perfection in St. Thomas's arguments for God's existence, from motion, from the distinction between essence and existence, from teleological patterns in the world that trace back to a transcendent design or transcendent source of all things.
Yeah, this is sort of an undermining of the rather central, basic Catholic teaching that any decent RCIA course tells you, that the faith is understood through reason, that you can reason your way to acknowledging that a God exists, and then even from there you can go further. And this is a sort of almost a direct attack on that concept, correct?
Yeah, it's a direct attack on it. So essentially, if we can't encounter God from the visible world, if we can't encounter God from without ourselves, where are we going to encounter God? Where are we going to encounter the divine? Well, we have to encounter it from within ourselves. And what is within ourselves? It's our experience. It's our inner subconsciousness, right? Pius X will say that what they basically do is they say our experience of God is hidden, deep within the recesses of our subconscious, according to the modernists, right? And so faith is basically, faith is not the assent of the mind to something that we pick up from the outside world. It's rather a it's the inner sentiment of man having sort of a internal experience of the divine from within himself.
which is sort of a replacing the human reason to almost emotional sort of understanding of God.
Exactly. Yeah.
So like, and I right out of paragraph 6 is something from this might be a Vatican I document. I'm not sure because the citation here is abbreviated, but it's right in the middle of paragraph 1. I'm just going to read this. If anyone says that the one true God, our Creator and Lord, cannot be known with certainty by the natural light of human reason by means of the things that are made, let him be anathema.
Yeah, that's Vatican I.
Yeah, and also, if anyone says that it is not possible or not expedient that man be taught through the medium of divine revelation about God and the worship to be paid to him, let him be anathema. And so when I see that, what it looks like to me is as philosophical agnosticism also undermines the ability to teach the faith. Like,
Yeah.
which is actually really insidious if you think about it, because
And what?
well, when you look at like the total collapse of evangelization since the council,
Yeah.
at this philosophical agnosticism almost seems to be like the underlying one of the many underlying causes of this.
Yeah, it basically kills evangelism as such, because if reason can't be a means by which you can adjudicate religious questions,
Mm-hmm.
and how are we going to adjudicate religious questions? Well, we have to basically
Have a dialogue, to use a modernist term,
Yeah, because dialogue, essentially what dialogue is, it's a communication of one's inner experience with
mm-hmm.
somebody else who has a different sort of a different expression of that inner experience, and that inner expression and that expression of that inner experience is basically what the modernists will call doctrine, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's basically that inner experience of the divine, rationalized, if you will, analyzed after the fact, of that indescribable, non-rational inner experience of God.
Mm-hmm.
The problem, of course, is that there's not really a rational basis on which to judge one over and against another. All you can really do is you could say that one expression of their inner religious experience is expressed in maybe a more full and maybe a fuller and maybe a more of a vivid way than another. So the modernists will say that, well, Catholicism is just the most vivid expression of that inner expression.
Or to quote a celebrity bishop recently, it's the privileged half.
Yeah, exactly.
And we can most of us have been to to an especially bad Novus Ordo parish at some point. And when you look at philosophical agnosticism and the emotion that it sort of relies upon, it becomes very easy to understand why you have this really sappy liturgical music, or any of the super inclusivity that you see in the mass now, because you want to have as many people involved as possible.
Because tradition, on their account, the church's liturgy, the church is basically there to cater to the need of that religious sense that we have deep within our heart. And if that evolves over time, then the church's traditions have to adapt according to what that inner religious sense requires.
Yes. Let's see. I want to go with this other one sentence here, and right afterwards in paragraph 6, it says, "If anyone says that divine revelation cannot be made credible by external signs, and that therefore men should be drawn to the faith only by their personal internal experience or by private inspiration, let him be anathema." Now, the really interesting thing when I read that is I haven't heard the modernists say that people can be drawn to the faith only by their personal internal experience. So, they still play, at least pay lip service to sort of the older ways of doing things, which is almost like their trump card with this, because, because they're
that later on, where he basically says the modernists, at least back then, they don't really have an antagonistic attitude toward the church's hierarchy.
Yeah, Karl Rahner wasn't really. I mean, Karl Rahner is one of the
Yeah,
people who is sort of like the godfather of the Second Vatican Council, and he
right.
is often talked about as being, not having that antagonism. He found himself on the wrong side of the hierarchy
Mm,
for a while, but
yeah.
he wasn't openly hostile to them
The reason,
the way that a lot of them now are.
yeah, the reason they weren't really hostile to the church's hierarchy and the church kind of uh, uh, laying down the law, as it were,
Mm,
is because they basically, what they do is they say the the church tradition basically functions according to two roles. It's conservation and progression. Um, and the progression is basically that inner religious sense that we talked about of the faithful, evolving over time.
mm-hmm,
And then the church, and then the hierarchy of the church is going to conserve um, the, maybe we could say, the totality of that outward expression of that inner religious sense from the past.
mm-hmm.
And then and you're going to have this kind of dialectic relationship between progression and conservation uh, move through history, and eventually um, the hierarchy will adapt to um, the progression of the faithful in their inner religious sense. So they basically see the hierarchy at the time just doing its garbage in garbage out job,
Mm-hmm.
and so they don't really see a need to attack it. But they believe that the hierarchy will eventually capitulate, and that it's basically inevitable that the hierarchy will adapt to the uh, the ever changing progression of that inner religious experience being expressed across time.
They it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy as well, because when the
Exactly.
modernists take over the seminaries and they train the next generation of bishops when they're just
Yeah.
seminarians, it's less of an expectation and more of a they know it's going to happen if things
Right.
persist.
It's important to underscore the fact that they really don't belong in the same religion,
Yeah,
in the sense that uh, they they really do believe, and this kind of gets into this idea of what was the thing after vital imminence?
let me go back to my notes here. Right after vital imminence is the radical evolutionism, as he called it, or just subjecting the faith to our modern conception of science.
Right. So what they do is they kind of divide the faith into uh, the real facts on the ground. So if you get from science and history, because since they've divorced anything theological from the external world of the senses. They've divorced anything pertaining to God from uh, our scientific world of experience, our uh, analysis of historical documents. You can't find God in any of these scientific modes of knowledge. So, because of that, they drive this wedge between what they will call the Christ of faith and the
Mm-hmm.
Christ of history. And we can kind of extend that out to, the the faith of, or we could say, um, the Christ of science versus the Christ of faith. The
And
Christ.
we've all seen every single Catholic who's paying attention has seen this in their lives. Whenever someone says, "Well, Gospel X, say the Gospel of Saint John,
Mm-hmm.
isn't really accurate. That was really him just turning the Christ of history into something he wasn't." We've all seen that in some form or another, and that's an example of what you're talking about there, I think.
Right. So when you, as a faithful Catholic, quote something like the Council of Trent to someone like Father James Martin,
Mm,
and you're scandalized that he doesn't just automatically change his position, right?
mm,
Yes, you should be scandalized, but you shouldn't be surprised because he's operating under a completely different methodology than you are. he doesn't see the magisterium of the church as the divine breaking into history in a real ontological sense and either course correcting the direction the church is going or just you know, clarifying under the guidance of the Spirit what the deposit of faith is. They instead see it as the church sort of after the fact of that inner religious sense that we talked about, trying to rationalize that across history and trying to put it into kind of a coherent way of thinking about it.
So I get the one problem I have with this is, as someone who at times looks at things too rationally, you would think that after they instituted this program, that the catastrophe that followed in the priests leaving the church and the faithful leaving in droves, they would have, reevaluated their position on some of this stuff. But that was obviously not how it played out. And by all accounts, it's not how it's going to play out either for the foreseeable future. So let's go on to vital imminence. Let's take a look to see what he says. I mean, it's like he introduces the concept of vital imminence in the very next paragraph. He says the agnosticism is only the negative part of the system. Is only the negative part of the system of the modernist. The positive side of it consists in what they call vital imminence. This is how they advance from one to the other. Religion, whether natural or supernatural, must, like every other fact, admit of some explanation. But when natural theology has been destroyed, the road to revelation closed through the rejection of the arguments of credibility, and all external revelation absolutely denied, it is clear that this explanation will be sought in vain outside man himself. It must therefore be looked for in man, and since religion is a form of life, the explanation must certainly be found in the life of man. Hence, the principle of religious imminence is formulated. So I understood religious imminence to be sort of, well, how would you define religious imminence in this way?
Yeah, it's basically, and we have to understand religious imminence has a direct consequence of bringing God out of the domain of reason.
Yeah.
Out of the domain of encountering God through the outside world. So religious imminence is basically the revelation of God happening within the depths of man's own inner heart. And so it's, as opposed to coming from without man, it comes from within man himself. And therefore anything pertaining to divine revelation has to be catered to the experience that one has within oneself of that inner religious sense.
And this is sort of where the Catholic charismatic movement has sort of emerged starting in the 70s and has found its way into nearly every Novus Ordo parish in the country, in the United States and in the Western world.
Oh yeah, that's religious imminence just run amok.
Yeah. There was at my alma mater, there was a group of South American missionaries. I don't want to get too detailed about where they're from because it'll reveal too much about me, but they were, they would celebrate the Mass, I say celebrate because it's the Novus Ordo Mass, but they would do it with a lot of reverence most of the time. But they would also do like the young adult guitar masses and that kind of thing. But they would also do these charismatic retreats where they were doing the praying in tongues and the calling down of the Holy Spirit and all of the things. And it's the strangest dichotomy to see when you can tell the priest understands what he's supposed to be doing at the Mass. He has a right ordered understanding of what the holy sacrifice of the Mass is supposed to be. And then they're doing the charismatic thing. and I don't actually understand how that. I didn't understand where that came from until I really like read about this principle we're talking about here. Of Because as Pius X says, it is a movement of the heart, which is called a sentiment, to quote him directly.
Mhm.
Therefore, since God is the object of religion, we must conclude that faith, which is the basis and foundation of all religion, consists in a sentiment which originates from a need of the divine. And the reason, like, I never could, the charismatic stuff always felt warped to me because I was never looking for the emotional sort of tie into religious practice. It happens naturally because that is, there are times in your life when you are at mass where you're going to have that experience, and that is a right ordered thing. But that's not why you're there. And it really looks like in most charismatic circles that is what you're dealing with.
Yeah. I mean, what it kind of does, and this is, of course, to the benefit of the modernist, is it disarms the church from any kind of from any kind of right to determine for you what revelation actually consists in.
Imagine the fallout if tomorrow we had a new pope, or Pope Francis even had a sudden change in everything about him, and actually exercise some of his papal authority and put an end to all of this stuff. What would be the fallout from it? I mean, it would be almost a catastrophe in terms of people leaving the church.
He probably wouldn't survive the next month.
probably not. Yeah, probably not, given the people he surrounds himself with.
Yeah. I mean, this just goes to show how poisonous modernism is, because essentially it warps the faith so much so that while keeping kind of the externals of it, while keeping the appearance of the faith, and thereby allowing you to stay in the church, it doesn't actually, it releases you from any kind of requirement to obediently assent to what the church determines.
Yeah, and here's the thing about this. Remember, Pius X called this the synthesis of all heresies.
Yeah,
so you're in
out from its roots.
Yeah, and but if it's a heresy, then you might be part of the Catholic Church, the organization, but are you part of the mystical body of Christ anymore if you are a modernist? Like a real modernist, and
right.
That's a hard question, because
it is a hard question, because the term modernism, it in itself, it's supposed to be defined according to very precise philosophical concepts that we're talking about right now. Unfortunately, what it's led to today is a lot of people who aren't necessarily modernists in the philosophical sense of the word. So, like, if you ask them, well, do you believe in this philosophical agnosticism? Do you believe in this vital imminence thing? A lot of them, I would guess, would probably say no. And they would believe that the church's magisterium is actually under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, clarifying the deposit of faith in a real ontological way. But unfortunately, they're impacted by the effects of modernism over time.
Yeah. Let's see if we can go a little bit further into vital imminence before we move on. But we have not yet come to the end of their philosophy, or, to speak more accurately, their folly. For modernism finds in this sentiment not faith only, but with and in faith as they understand it, revelation, they say, abides. For what more can one require of revelation? Is that not religious sentiment which is perceptible in the consciousness revelation, or at least the beginning of revelation? Nay, is not God himself, as he manifests himself to the soul, indistinctly, it is true, in the same religious sense, revelation? And they add, since God is both the object and the cause of faith, this revelation is at the same time of God and from God. That is, God is both the revealer and the revealed. And
Yeah.
that is on a surface reading, you're like, I don't see a problem with that, except you'll sometimes see people talking about, just follow where the Spirit leads you. And if you're aware of the nature of like everything that the church teaches about things like spiritual warfare, you can be like, well, that might be a spirit talking to you, but is it the Holy Spirit that is
Right. It's
talking
just
to
opening yourself up to.
you? or have you just crafted a god of your own creation,
Yeah.
which is actually probably even worse.
And this is the problem, as a direct consequence of the philosophical agnosticism, is it subjects revelation to the perpetual motion of the sentiments, of the passions, essentially, and thereby giving the modernist free rein to craft his own theology independently of what the church would determine as authentic positive faith.
Which essentially turns the magisterium into an elite managerial class for the church.
Right, exactly, and that can therefore lead to an attempt on part of the modernists to pit the laity against the church.
Also, think about it this way. If people have ever wondered why their bishops spend more time raising money than they do talking about the faith in more than a very superficial kind of way, and this isn't all bishops, but there are plenty of them that do this, this is why. This is one example of why. Because if a modernist bishop truly is a modernist and believes in philosophical agnosticism, then what is their job to do other than ordain priests and keep the lights on? And well, the other thing that we can get into with this, which is the how the modernists managed to marry this to a secular progressive sort of political activism, because
right.
Progressive politics. I'm a political scientist by training, and I'll tell you that progressive politics are very much preying on the emotions. Now, that's not to say that American conservatives aren't guilty of this either, but there is a sort of a lack of rationality in the secular progressive realm. And
and I think we shouldn't ignore the fact that a lot of these modernists are politically motivated.
Oh yeah,
it's not just fuzzy theological speculations they're engaging in for theology's sake. They're basically trying to cater the church to these new at the time new effects of 19th century liberalism taking hold of the world at the time.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I've noted that I like, the video that I'm uploading tomorrow it's already done and it's available for my patrons, but it'll go live early in the morning. It's about the passing of Cardinal Danneels. And if you look at the things he was involved in, and I don't mean like the sex abuse allegations against him, which I barely go into because that's almost passé with him. That's pretty well known stuff. But he was involved in getting abortion legalized in his country.
Wow.
Yeah. So that gives you an idea of what we're dealing with here, because if I say a public figure says, I am personally against abortion, but it should be legal.
Right. That's essentially, that's exactly a result of this vital imminence and philosophical agnosticism taking hold, because what it's essentially saying is that, in the world of the outside, right, in the world of in the political reality of concrete experience informed by our scientific study of human biology, which they get wrong, but that's beside the point.
Yeah.
And that has its own sovereign and autonomous and independent domain, because it can't be informed by the rule of faith, which is something that can only be imprinted on us from within ourselves. It can't be impacted from the world outside. And so because of that, and this is basically, it's kind of like a re-emergence of the double truth theory that was kind of prominent in the Middle Ages that St. Thomas was combating, this idea that you have truths of faith and truths of reason in their own autonomous and sovereign and independent categories. And if they, and in that sense, they can't really conflict with each other because they're in totally different domains, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if a truth of reason doesn't exactly correspond with the truth of faith, well, that doesn't really matter because they don't touch anyway as categories.
Yeah, and I believe Pius X does go into that actually at some point in this document, probably around hour 1.5 of my recording of it.
An important thing to understand is like these modernist ideas, they're new in their application. They're not entirely new in their presence in the church, right? It's kind of a it's kind of a collection of old heretical ideas being brought into this like mammoth, we could say.
Which is odd too, because there are modernist priests who will tell people, at least in their RCIA, that that they shouldn't take communion under X, Y, and Z circumstances. Which is, I've heard them say this because I've been to several different parishes before I found before my wife and I found ourselves in the couple of parishes we go regularly now. And you would think that, if the faith is an experience based entirely on essentially relativism, because that's what we're really talking about, is a form of relativism, then there is almost no circumstance that you should be able to deny people the faith or deny people the sacrament. Right. Which is odd because we also see the modernists talk half jokingly about wanting to deny people the sacrament for having essentially the wrong political opinions. Do you remember when the border debate was going on recently, and there was actually talk about denying ICE agents the sacrament? That's madness. The same people who are fine with Nancy Pelosi receiving the sacrament want to deny, border patrol agents the sacrament
This is an important thing to tie back into this encyclical, because what Pius X will say is that the modernists want to draw a wedge between the world of external experience, science, history, philosophy, that domain, and the domain of faith, which comes from within oneself. What they end up doing, because we inevitably live in the external world, we inevitably live in the world of the senses. What inevitably happens is that faith becomes subordinated to what Pius X will call science, quote unquote. It's not real science, but these are the categories the modernists are playing with. And so you kind of see that played out in this situation, because what is the issue of border control? Well, that's a issue more or less within the realm of politics, the realm of securing the secular state. And so what they're doing is they're subordinating the truths of the faith. They're subordinating, let's say, for example, pro-choice politicians. That pertains to a spiritual, moral issue of abortion. They're subordinating that to something like immigration restriction.
Yeah.
So you can kind of see here, in that situation, they're subordinating something more directly pertaining to the faith to something that is more or less situated in a purely political realm. Now, of course, in our understanding, it's all supposed to be holistically united under one unity of truth, both supernatural and natural. But you can see what I'm saying.
Yeah. So let's see here. Back to Pascendi. We haven't talked yet about the other central point. So I don't want to make this a super long live stream. I don't think there's any reason to necessarily do that. Is the subjection of the faith to science, or what Pius X called radical evolutionism. And we've seen this before, and they're playing off of what used to be one of my favorite quotes from Aquinas. I don't even remember where he said this, probably the Summa, but he said essentially that that the faith and objective reality cannot contradict
Yeah.
each other, and people always twist that to mean that like we should subject the faith to science because it's so easy to subject that to subject that passage, that selectively chosen passage from the Summa.
Ironically commits the same error that Aquinas was combating in that passage.
What was he saying in that passage as we get into this, into this?
What he's saying is the truths of the faith and the truths of reason, they're under the same domain of truth as such.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're under the same domain of truth as such, it's impossible for them to conflict because truth cannot be at odds with itself. Being cannot be at odds with itself. And natural truth, supernatural truth, it's all under the realm of being, within the same reality sourced in the divine. Now, that doesn't for a second subordinate the truths of faith to the truths of natural science. In reality, it subordinates the truths of natural science to the truths of faith.
Mm-hmm.
Because since they're all safely situated within the same domain, there's a hierarchy within that domain.
And this plays into how scientists used to be trained.
Yeah.
Scientists actually used to be trained in philosophy. A lot of people don't realize that.
That's what it was called.
Yeah, you wouldn't actually know that listening to like the celebrity scientists we have now.
Yeah.
Because like I've only ever read a couple of books in my entire life that made me want to throw a book across the room, and The God Delusion was one of those books. It was obvious that he knew what he was talking about when talking about cellular division and whatnot, but he tried to did you ever read that book?
Yeah.
So his handling of Aquinas, when I tell you about his handling of Aquinas, it was cringe-inducing.
Yeah, it completely. I think he even goes so far as to Aquinas' fourth way about degrees of perfection.
Mm-hmm.
He tries to counter that by saying, well, if you have degrees of perfection, then what about degrees of smelliness or something? Missing the point that Aquinas is talking about degrees of very specific transcendentals, like truth and being.
And to give you an idea of how bad the modernist infestation has been in our seminaries, a lot of seminarians left seminary after reading his book. There are a lot of stories around the country about that, and that's an indictment on our seminary formations.
Complete indictment on the church, because that book should not be able to dissuade anybody.
Not anybody who has even a basic understanding of like critical thinking.
And Dawkins doesn't. I mean, there's this one. I don't want to get too off track, but there's this one interview that Dawkins has with Rowan Williams, who was Archbishop of Canterbury before the present one, and it was moderated by Anthony Kenny, who incidentally studied a lot of scholasticism.
Was that the interview where he talks about Adam and Eve and original sin?
But he wasn't even aware of the concept of divine simplicity. This was like the first time he heard of it.
So could you just give like the TLDR of what divine simplicity is for the typical Catholic on the street?
Right.
They just need to know about this.
Of divine simplicity, essentially, that God is not composed of any parts. He's not composed of any division, and there's no composition in God, essentially, because in composed things that are composed of parts, the parts are subordinated to the whole, and the whole is also contingent or dependent upon the parts out of which it's made. So if God were composed of any parts, he would be his existence would need some accounting for about himself.
Divine simplicity is essentially the idea that when you get to sort of that original mover position, you're not going to find a complex machine. You're going to find just how does Barron actually, to his credit, has a good way of describing this. What is it? The subsistence of being itself, I think, is how he describes it.
Yeah, the subsistent act of being itself in its transcendental unity.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So what do you think Pius X means by radical evolutionism, or the subjecting the faith to science?
Right. The important thing to understand about his account of evolution is that it reflects how the modernist understands the church and how the modernist understands dogma. The modernist doesn't see dogma or the magisterium of the church as the Holy Spirit breaking into human history and clarifying what the deposit of faith really is in a real, transcendent, uh, supernatural way. He instead sees dogma, he sees the church's doctrine as basically a secondary rationalization of that inner religious experience that we talked about that comes from the heart.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the church's job to basically put that into rational coherence and rational categories after the fact. So the dogma, the doctrine, that comes after that inner subjective experience of the divine. And because of that, it has to be subject to change, doesn't it? Because
Mm-hmm.
that inner religious experience can be sensed differently across history. There's no guarantee that it's going to be the same because it's from within the sense. And the sense is always subject to the motions and the passions throughout the ages. So the church's uh, dogma is essentially, its job is to cater to that inner religious experience. It's meant to put that inner religious experience into a systematic framework, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
That systematic framework has no guarantee of divine protection because it's a human institution, according to the modernist. So, because it has no guarantee of divine protection, when you quote, say, the syllabus of errors, and you say, Father James Martin, how can you possibly say this about homosexuality? Haven't you read the traditional text of our magisterium? He would just, he doesn't have the same grasp of what a dogma is as you do.
Yeah, and he's going to also say, well, science has said that people are hashtag born this way, which is also nonsense. But
exactly,
but he's going to say that, and I'm looking here at what Pius X labeled paragraph 17, even though it's paragraph 17 is 3 paragraphs long. Yeah. It's a short paragraph, and I'll just quote him directly. Thus it is evident that science is to be entirely independent of faith, while on the other hand, and notwithstanding that they are supposed to be strangers to each other, faith is made subject to science. So, like, our moral codes, all of a sudden, if there's a scientific fad, our moral code, whether it's how we are supposed to live our lives as, complete human beings with right ordered human sexuality, to stay with the James Martin thing, or all of a sudden, littering is a sin, then it's because our faith is subject to science, right?
Right.
And, I'm not going to argue against the idea that God gave us this magnificent creation, that we should probably be good stewards of it, because there's a basic piety requires us to treat the things God gives us with utmost respect. And, that's really all you need to say about, Catholic and Catholicism and environmentalism. But, that's not how it's taught anymore.
Right.
But he says that statement that I read is in direct opposition to Pius IX, where he says, in matters of religion, it is the duty of philosophy not to command, but to serve, but not to prescribe what is to be believed, but to embrace what is to be believed with reasonable obedience, not to scrutinize the depths of the mysteries of God, but to venerate them devoutly and humbly. And there is this, again, we go back to the celebrity scientists who, they're evangelical atheists, one and all of them, every single one of them, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of times they are given more respect in Catholic circles than than they're warranted, because most of them aren't actually that smart when you really listen to what they're talking about. And the other, because why would you give that much respect to people who insult
Yeah.
the faith at every turn?
I mean, just look at the subject of, we're talking about evolution of dogma. Look at the subject of biological evolution. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that a Catholic cannot in any way entertain anything pertaining to, the theory of Darwinian evolution. But the point is, what this turns into is too much of a respect for the atheistic scientists' autonomy in their own field to have dominance over how the faith is to be interpreted. To where, if you object, if you basically want to give any kind of credence, any kind of respect for the historical narrative of Scripture in Genesis, you'll basically be laughed off the stage,
Mm-hmm.
as if the fathers of the church have no have no relevance to this subject. And this is essentially, again, a result of the evolution of dogma, because the church fathers, their job in the eyes of the modernist, it worked for that time because it catered to the inner religious sentiments of the people at that time. But now we have different inner religious sentiments, and we live in a different world. And because we live in a different world, well, our doctrine, our magisterium, it has to cater to what the sentiments of today are.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. So, how would you say that modernism's effect is on the sacraments and on sacred scripture?
Yeah, the sacraments, I think, are important, because what Pius X will say is that because dogma and because the church's tradition is basically just an after-the-fact rationalization of the inner religious sentiment, the sacraments are reduced basically to symbols.
Which
Yeah,
explains why so few Catholics today are even aware of the dogma of the real presence.
right.
If you see the polling data on that, even if the polling data questions are poorly formulated, still there's still some truth to those numbers, and it's very disturbing when you actually really dive into how many Catholics don't understand the real presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist.
Right, because it's not, for the modernists, it's not, the sacrament isn't God's presence imprinting itself on the external sensible order. It's
Mm-hmm.
the church trying to cater to our inner religious sentiment of God's presence through whatever symbols the church can make use of.
Yeah, so here in paragraph 21, the Pope says, "For them, the sacraments are the resultant of a double need. For as we have seen, everything in their system is explained by inner impulses or necessities. In the
Yeah.
present case, the first need is that of giving some sensible manifestation to religion. The second is that of propagating it, which could not be done without some sensible form and consecrating acts, and these are called sacraments."
Right.
So this is essentially, the Eucharist becomes an external validation of your sort of
Yeah.
emotional status as you understand your
Yeah.
relationship with your understanding of God.
The emotional need to be connected to that Christ figure, to
Mm-hmm.
the Christ of faith, essentially, as they would say, not the Christ of history, the Christ of faith. that we as pious Catholics have that emotional urge to be connected to. And so the Eucharist is essentially that symbolic manifestation to validate that need within the heart, to validate it with physical forms,
Mm-hmm.
rites, and ceremony. And because they don't see anything externally divine in the sacrament itself, and they don't see the church's preservation of a very particular manner of worship as guided by the Holy Spirit, then there's really no need to preserve. There's really no absolute need to preserve a manner of celebrating the Eucharist, which is why they're very quick to do away with a lot of the um, external prayers with the uh, gestures,
Or
um,
even lately in the news, people giving voice to the idea of changing even the form and matter of the Eucharist itself.
right? Because if the people, if they're in a religious sentiment, if you read that, hey, maybe they need more simplicity, well, let's give them more simplicity,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and so there's really no absolute need on part of the modernists to safeguard these rituals that to them are really just useful uh, symbols to validate something that's really just subjective and at the end of the day just psychological.
Yeah. And he ends paragraph 21 of this with a condemnation from the Council of Trent. If anyone say that these sacraments are instituted solely to foster the faith, let him be anathema. And again, they get around this because they won't say that the sacraments are there solely to foster the faith. Emphasis on solely, because the modernist will give lip service to the traditional Catholic understanding of things. It's always the devil is in the details, and in the details we mean how they act on what they actually believe.
Right. This is why it was good for Pius X to get into the inner principles that uh, operate behind the term modernism, right?
Yeah.
Because as he gives the analogy of the tree, these are the roots of the tree. We don't really see directly the roots of the tree. We just see its outward manifestation. We see the trunk, we see the leaves, but we're not really directly looking at the roots that underlie the tree's existence. And these are the principles that underlie modernism's existence. And when you get at the heart of the principles, you begin to see why. We're reading the same documents. We're reading the Council of Trent. We're reading, say, the Syllabus of Errors, but we're uh, deriving from that very different interpretations. And
Mm-hmm.
the interpretations are because we're different trees, essentially.
Yeah. So, what would you say modernism's effect is on sacred scripture?
Yeah, well, because, and again, this goes back to the philosophical agnosticism point, because uh, the things of God, uh, because the divine is taken out of the external world of the senses and therefore out of science. Because it's out of science, it's also out of history. Because God has to be taken out of history, then we have to read the Bible according to these two categories that can't touch each other, and that's the categories of history and the category of faith.
Mm-hmm.
And so the category of history, because you've stripped history of any kind of uh, direct relationship to God, you also have to remove it from any kind of point at which God enters into history directly, be it through miracles, be it through just divine intervention. Um, and so you have to read biblical history in an absolutely atheistic sense.
Hmm.
And then once you've read history in an absolutely atheistic sense, um, you can sever it from how we're going to interpret the Bible according to the lens of faith. And so that's how they divide the Christ of faith from the Christ of history.
And they do that, as Pius X says here, that God does indeed speak in these books through the medium of the believer, but only according to modernistic theology by vital imminence and permanence. Now, what do you think he means by permanence?
By permanence, I think. Let's see. I think he's saying here. Usually, when he talks about permanence, I think he's talking about the concept of tradition in the church.
Okay, yeah.
Tradition kind of serves as the means by which that imminent religious sense is able to be expressed in a permanent and stable way across centuries. But the imminent experience is
Reinterprets that sort of permanence.
yeah.
Yeah. Because he goes on to talk about inspiration. And
Right. The inspiration is basically that's going to be that divine imminence within the biblical author within his own, inner heart, I guess we could say.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So let's see. So modernism obviously has some effects on the evolution of doctrine. One of our there are a couple of favorite terms we hear thrown around a lot are the development of doctrine, as well, which is a term I think is probably is development of doctrine a modernist term, or is that more of a just a?
It's not essentially a modernist term. I think it was popularized by Cardinal Newman, as far as I remember. Now, the development of doctrine, you can find that in Saint Vincent of Lerins, even,
Oh, okay.
where he will say, but he will qualify that and say, doctrine can be developed in the sense that it can be deepened. Our understanding of the same doctrine can deepen, but in the same sense, in the same judgment as what we have received from the apostles.
Right. So you'll see today some Catholics in our sort of who share our sort of concerns and our traditional our attempts to be traditional Catholics, hoping that we'll get an Orthodox Catholic or Orthodox Pope who will say things, who will do something like, dogmatically define what the Virgin Mary being the mediatrix of all graces,
right,
for example. Now, that would be part of the development of doctrine, but the mediatrix of graces isn't exactly a new concept in the faith either.
Yeah, it's not. Well, I think a good example would be, I think it would be transubstantiation. Now, transubstantiation, the concept of the real presence, that is in the deposit of faith from the apostles.
Yeah.
But were the apostles talking about substance and accidents?
No.
They
weren't using that
about these concepts in their refined philosophical and intellectual sense.
Yeah, in a more basic way. They weren't using that kind of terminology,
right,
and giving it that the kind of rumination that Aquinas and others would later give it. But they were teaching it.
But does transubstantiation constitute a change from what the apostles taught regarding the real presence? No, it's a deeper understanding of the implications, logical implications that flow from a doctrine like the real presence.
Yeah,
being ruminated upon over the centuries by the doctors of the church who, contrary to the modernists, subordinate their intellectual labors to the judgment of the church.
So I want to go and wrap this up by talking about not the causes of modernism, not anything else about this encyclical, but something I've been thinking about in relation to modernism is how are traditional Catholics susceptible to modernism? Because of the primacy of the individual experience of the believer is something that should be a red flag for everybody. And this this was something that's been on my mind since I listened to Sensus Fidelium's recent series by Father Ripperger on tradition. And he actually talks about this a little bit, about how a lot of traditional Catholics are, drawn to the traditional liturgy, but then don't, adopt the traditional faith in any other meaningful sense, and that's essentially just an experiential Catholicism.
Right. I think that's a good way to put it. That I don't know how pervasive this is. I'm not someone who really has a much experience with like a core group of traditional Catholics in my day-to-day personal life. I'm kind of disassociated from any kind of traditional Catholic block, we could say. But I would imagine, and I do see it online from time to time. Some people clearly are drawn to the traditional liturgy because it caters more to their inner sense of what the church should look like. And because of that, they're able to sort of sideline some theological issues that may come up. I think a perfect example would be sedevacantism.
Hmm.
Now, this isn't the case for all sedevacantists. I mean, I'm not. I think that's, of course, a wrong position.
I'm not a sedevacantist, but I also have a general rule, which is I'm not. I try to avoid what I would call intertrad squabbling,
Right.
because I think it's extremely counterproductive.
Yeah.
But that's having been said, I disagree with sedevacantists, but I have sedevacantist subscribers, and
Right.
they're welcome to
Well,
participate.
here's what I could say.
Yeah, yeah.
Without even necessarily uh, refuting the principle of sedevacantism as such, uh, there could be, some who are drawn to sedevacantism because of an inner feeling that, God wouldn't let it get this far.
Hmm.
God wouldn't let the church to be in such shambles and such disarray. So because of that inner intuition, I'm going to, uh, based on that inner intuition, delegitimize the authority of the Pope, since my determination of when the crisis began.
Yeah, or I think even in a more basic way, there if you're attending the traditional Latin Mass purely because it's a more beautiful and outwardly reverent form of the liturgy,
Yeah.
and you find yourself going to the High Mass exclusively, I think a good test for this to see if you're susceptible is to start going to the Low Mass instead. Most traditional parishes that offer a High Mass also offer a Low Mass.
Hmm.
The inverse isn't necessarily true, though. Like, I've encountered Low Mass parishes that only offer the Latin Mass in the Low Mass form. So if you think that you might be susceptible to that, simply just go to the Low Mass. There's no music, there's no chant. The Mass is almost silent except during the readings.
I think that's a
And
good practice, just to make sure that your devotion is to the faith and the presence of Christ as such, and not to the externalities that may attract your senses, but uh, may, if left unchecked, uh, lead to an overemphasis on those externalities to where you're more susceptible to maybe being swayed um, against the truth of the faith in maybe other areas.
yeah, I mean, and then the other part of this is also you might be attracted to traditional Catholicism because of the consequences of the sort of the socio-political consequences of the
Yeah,
faith.
that's a big thing, I think, especially online today, where a lot of people, you know, they belong in maybe like dissident right wing circles or something.
Mhm.
They see the faith as, they see, traditional Catholicism as the best expression of European identity. And but in their private lives, are they really following through the specific demands of the faith? Maybe not, but they're attracted to that idea of the church as essentially European, or maybe not the church is essentially European, but the church's presence in Europe as integral to its identity, right?
They reduce the faith to for instrumental purposes essentially,
Yeah,
and
and I think that's a danger.
yeah, and in another way you can understand this too is that this again comes from that Father Ripperger series on Sensus Fidelium, where he's talking about how traditional Catholics are having some serious problems in the confessional with purity. He says he has spoken with many priests, traditional Catholic priests, and they report what sound like higher rates of sins against the sixth and ninth commandments than you hear in Novus Ordo parishes, which by the way is terrifying because I
Yeah,
know I've seen the data on Novus Ordo confessions about
and
and
they're
heard from priests, and it's like 85% of men or 90% of men and 85% of women or something like that are confessing those sins. And so I don't even want to think about that if
well,
Father Ripperger is correct on that.
yeah.
Although
Is he talking about like within that category, uh, greater gravity, or more frequency?
he didn't specify,
Okay.
and he also brought in his rather controversial concept of generational spirits and other things like that into it. But
Yeah.
and he didn't also talk about whether or not that's simply because traditional Catholics are more prone to going to confession more often.
I think uh, one reason that could be a cause of that, and I'm not sure. I don't have any data to back it up or anything, but I could see that maybe you could, maybe as a traditional Catholic, you may be more susceptible to the idea that you're part of God's remnant, and
Hmm.
because of God's remnant, you feel more assured of your salvation. You feel more assured that God will see to it that you'll make it in the end. And
Yeah.
so maybe you become less scrupulous about um, the specific actions of what you're doing at each particular moment,
Hmm.
and and instead may see, oh well, I'm part of God's remnant. I'm part of one of the last true traditional Catholics out there. God would never suffer me to lose my soul.
No, yeah. See, like one of the things I try to remind myself as a good defense against that of that very prideful thinking is I've met Novus Ordo Catholics
Yeah.
who seem to have their holiness far better together than I do. So
Yeah, I mean,
that's a
like
controversial thing to say to some people,
yeah,
but it's the truth.
it's true. Yeah.
I guess I want to end on this, and it's just an observation that I had when I did a quick rescanning of Pascendi in the last couple of days.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the things that modernism seems to embrace is a rejection of the social reign of Christ the King. And that's, I mean, that sounds obvious in hindsight, really, but if you look at the history of the like what was being proposed at the council versus what was actually implemented, there were people trying to get explicit language of Christ the King
Yeah.
in the documents that would have been promulgated, and of course they were voted down. One of the things I'm working on is recording the original schema for the Second Vatican Council and uploading them. I've got one document done. I'm not going to upload it till I have the whole thing done, and
Awesome.
only 5 of 9 of the documents have been released in English, so it'll be 5 of 9. It's night and day compared to what was released. So
yeah, it's basically that same issue that Pius X talks about. You start off with subordinating the faith to science. Subordinated the faith to science, you therefore inevitably have to subordinate the faith to history. And once you've subordinated the faith to history, you therefore have to subordinate the church to the laity. Once you subordinate the church to the laity, you have to subordinate the church to the state, and then eventually subordinate God to man. And that's, I guess, the end result of it, obviously.
Yeah, and that's why I think you see that's ultimately, you can't have Christ the King and the U.S. Conference of Bishops giving out the sums of money they do to very questionable NGOs. If you've ever seen the data on that, it's one of those things that you can't. It's this you've got social reign of Christ the King in one hand, and you've got political expediency in the other, and they're not. They're never going to meet. They're not compatible. All right, so I think we did a pretty decent job of covering this in a way that's actually relevant to people, because we didn't we went into the theology and philosophy of things, but we didn't necessarily go into what I would call like the really deep dive that you would get in some college class somewhere, which is what I was trying.
Too many unnecessary tangents, but I think we got a core of it pretty.
Yeah, and tangents are fine because we were able to loop it back around to what we were talking about anyway, and they were still somewhat relevant. So,
yeah.
So in closing, why don't you again tell people where they can find you online if they want to? I've pinned a link to your channel in the pinned comments here. So if people want to find you, they can do that in the pinned comment below. Yeah. But where else can they find you?
My channel is just a classical theist. My Twitter, it's at classical theist. Someone else had classical theist, so I just dropped the T off. So if you want to find me on Twitter, just do at classical theist.
And you're also on Curious Cat, and the reason I even mentioned that is because the things that you repost from Curious Cat are amusing, and I think you need a higher caliber of questions being asked of you. So
well, you can find if you find my Twitter, I have my Curious Cat linked there.
Yeah.
Just a fair warning, I probably won't get to your question for a while. I have a lot of unanswered questions that I still have to get to, but we'll try to get that done. So thanks for having me. This was fun.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate you taking the time and your patience with the technical errors. We actually we did actually try to start at 8:00, but we had to work through some stuff. So anyway, thanks again for coming on, and thank you all for joining us live. Have a nice night, everybody.